Greetings, everyone. I'm Dave Fortson, and welcome to another episode of the Green Proofing series. I'm very excited today to have an item to discuss that's close to what we're doing here at Regen Network that I'm very excited to learn more about from an expert in the space. I'm happy to bring on Conservation International's Director of Corporate Climate Solutions and the Insetting lead, Elijah Innes Wimsett. And if I said that incorrectly, please let me know. Close enough. All right. And a new transplant to Uruguay. Welcome to your new place. Tell me something about Uruguay that I don't know.
Oh man, well, largest beef consumption per
Okay,
capita, but it's all grass-fed beef, which is kind of
amazing.
interesting, and must be top or very high on the mate
Mate
consumption if you know
consumption,
anything about
great.
mate.
I'm on the
They
green tea
love
consumption
coffee.
here, so bear with my jitteriness as we're getting moving here. But excited to have you on. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it. And why don't we go ahead and start with tell us a little bit about your story. You're here at Conservation International. Clearly, this isn't your first rodeo in thinking or in being in the sustainability professional field. Anything about your background professionally or personally that would be interesting for folks to hear about your journey into the space?
Sure. Yeah, I had a little bit of a meandering journey. I want people, yeah, my organization, which is full of a lot of very qualified biologists, and it's a very diverse organization, but ecology and biology are common backgrounds. I have a mechanical engineering degree, so my path was not exactly a direct pipeline into conservation. But so I started out doing contract manufacturing, my first job out of college, which I was very interested in international component of it. Spent a decent amount of time in China, but also I've always been really interested in like kind of understanding the how and why, getting a little bit into the weeds of how like our global systems work. And through that time, obviously got to spend some time on some factory floors and see some of the environmental safeguards that are taken and stuff like that. And also just do fun stuff like run 3D printers and look at, yeah, things that tweaked my engineering brain. But I was definitely interested in something that was a little more impact oriented. And so after that, I went back to a consulting role actually, a large global consulting firm hired by the U.S. Department of Energy doing energy efficiency standards. So very in the weeds, very technical, applying my engineering degree, but actually very high impact. The total U.S. energy level, they said energy efficiency standards have huge climate benefits, but also super, super technical and in the weeds. And from there, I was always, even in engineering school, I was always very interested in kind of cross-disciplinary stuff. And there was just starting up in the U.S. a corporate climate advisory services that they were starting to do at my firm. And I elbowed my way into, raised my hand a few times to start volunteering in that service line, and then gradually became my focus. And so that was helping big global companies set their science-based targets, do greenhouse gas footprinting, some stuff on circular economy, some stuff with cities, corporate or yeah, kind of climate strategy oriented. And so I learned greenhouse gas accounting and all that stuff on the job. And then worked with a guy from the nonprofit world. I grew up in both crunchy granola academic parents, was very environmentally oriented, was always kind of interested in the mission driven nonprofit side and was curious about it. And an opportunity came up to come to CI they were looking for Conservation International, my current employer. And they were looking for someone because they had a lot of expertise, as I mentioned, on ecological systems, of course, on restoration, on working with communities, and on some on carbon finance, but it's all from the voluntary carbon
Yeah,
market side of things. They hadn't done a lot getting finance within company supply chains, and so they were looking for someone who knew that ecosystem, and I became that
amazing.
person.
Welcome, and I'm excited to have you there. So why don't we jump right in? Settings is an emerging space. It feels like, from my perspective, there's a fuzziness to it.
Mhm.
I think for those of us who've been in the offsetting space, where companies or
Yeah.
corporations or institutions can opt to purchase a carbon credit that is verified sequestration or removal of carbon somewhere else in the world, typically as a means of reaching their
Mhm.
climate goals of being net carbon neutral or net zero or whatever. Insetting
Mhm.
offers companies a way of really digging into their own supply chains or their own internal operations and examining, like, how can we continue to reduce or remove carbon or have more ecologically superior practices implemented on the ground. So that's an exciting area, I think, right? It's a little tighter loop around really tying impact and solutions under the same brand hood or under the same company, instead of offsetting or mitigating in other parts of the world, which just create that distance sometimes creates its own unique problems. So I'm curious, Conservation International has dedicated space to this through you. Can you paint a picture a little bit more about Conservation International's role in thinking, in stimulating the broader adoption, and I assume an ideation and kind of intellectual architecture of what insetting programs are going to look like moving forward. Can you paint a picture for that for us a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So those who aren't familiar with our organization, so Conservation International is a global environmental NGO. We have country programs in something like 30 countries, very oriented towards the global south, headquarters in Washington, D.C. area, but all of our work essentially is done on the ground in Latin America, in Africa, Southeast Asia, and then the Pacifics program, and Australia, I guess, as well. So we're very much like something like two-thirds of the organization staff sit in the country programs. So a lot of our core focuses is like doing the work on the ground, working with indigenous peoples to improve protection of in the Amazon, for example, or to improve management of cattle in South and Eastern Africa, or to improve, to restore forests in Indonesia, et cetera, et cetera. So that was always going to be a component of what we're trying to do on insetting is like, how do we actually how do we use this as a new finance lever to support that really important work on the ground? But we recognize pretty clearly, as you said, it's a nation space. It's interesting because if you talk to folks who come from the world that I came from, they'd say it's not nation at all. It's all they've been doing. It's just focusing on within value chain stuff. And then separately, you have this VC, voluntary carbon market, beyond value chain bucket, and those two. So we don't meet in between, right? Like they're two separate levers. But what we've been trying to push for, and it's not just us. I mean, it's been definitely a consortium of peer organizations and other companies and project developers with similar mindset, is that insetting offers this. And the reason we're still using the term insetting, which is annoying because it means different things to different people and sometimes can cause challenge because of that. But the reason we've held on to that is because basically recognize that the constraints of the greenhouse gas accounting rules, the stuff that determines what counts towards a company's carbon footprint, it's very prescriptive, which is important for comparability, but it's very limiting. And until a couple of years ago, maybe 5 years ago, companies couldn't even really count for land sector related emissions, or especially for removals. There wasn't consistent rules for emissions accounting, and removals didn't count at all. So that's planting trees on farms, for example, towards their carbon footprint. And so this was an untapped lever from that perspective. But at the same time, and the rules haven't been finalized yet, they're still being finalized now, but we expect that there's going to be quite very strong limits in what can count towards a company's carbon footprint, both like physically. If you often in a production landscape talk about a coffee landscape or cocoa or soy or whatever, every farm is obviously operating in the context of this huge production landscape, and all of these different actors are making production decisions every year. And it's pretty, you can't be very effective in supporting the kind of landscape transition that's needed by focusing just on the I buy soy, or I buy some soy byproducts, so I will just focus on the soy plot in the year it's producing soy. That becomes very restrictive. And so we need to broaden. That's just one example of how we need to broaden, allow this carbon as an anchor, what you were mentioning. Use this tool of companies have a lot of pressure to manage their carbon footprint for good reason. Use that pressure and tool to support this kind of landscape transformation, both in the physical way, as I said, supporting a full landscape, not just focusing on their farm they may be buying from, but also in the kind of thematic ways that we recognize that carbon is just the easy to measure thing, but these things are very well tied to community livelihoods, to ecosystem health, to biodiversity, like the measures that you could potentially use this funding to support on the ground, like restoring riparian areas or restoring forests or improving soil health. Those all can have, if they're properly incentivized and considered, can have really cross-cutting benefits, not just for our climate, but also to combat the biodiversity loss, and also to support the resilience of communities. And so bringing it all back together, but the rules don't necessarily require that right now. Like companies don't have clear incentives to have that holistic view. So our goal is to, at the global, we have two kind of pillars of our work. One is doing it on the ground, of course. And the other one is how do we remove the global barriers to scale and to high quality for insetting? So how do we make sure that those standards that dictate action are clearly incentivizing what we know is the right thing to do, incentivizing that kind of holistic.
So how does that show up though for Conservation International now? Because that was going to be my next question: is the state of insetting as we move into 2026? What are if you could name a few of the kind of core barriers that exist for
Yeah,
broad adoption of insetting programs globally across global supply chains. So what are the
right.
barriers? What do you see as opportunities to remove those barriers? And what should we be looking for maybe as we're moving even toward the end of 2026 that is exciting for you?
Yeah, yeah. So a main barrier has been just unclarity as far as what counts and what doesn't count towards a company's carbon footprint and limitations. So a lot of companies have gone out and done some pilot projects because they've been working with partners like us who say, hey, we know this landscape, these are the, or other through local partners. They're doing often funding the stuff that is needed in the landscape and now coming back and saying, okay, does it count towards our science-based target? Not sure or no. Does it count towards our carbon footprint? Not sure or no. And then that gives them fear, uncertainty,
Yep.
doubt. They're not going to expand that pilot if they can't figure out a way to have it count towards the targets that they're forced to manage. And so I think that's been, or just lack of knowledge, full stop. For example, they may not even know where they're buying from, so they can't even start because the accounting rules require a certain level of transparency, of traceability, excuse me. And there's few other accounting. We just put out a report in May with a bunch of other, like 25 other endorsing partners that kind of quantifies and walks through some of those specific challenges. But there's a lot of accounting kind of related challenges for what counts. And then more broadly, of course, it's as we've seen in the political landscape the last few years, it's not a given that companies are going to have only increasing pressure to do carbon for carbon's sake. I know we both have pretty solid American accents here. We know that the U.S. is not necessarily going to be from the leadership level pushing for that. But all of these elements, a lot of these actions, obviously can be supporting the other really real business risks that companies are facing in terms of, I don't know, the list of commodities. There's 10 or 15 commodities that have all had 100% price volatility or something on that order, like huge price volatility due to climate related shocks in the last few years. And if we can clearly connect, but many of the actions we're taking, for example, restoring a watershed upstream from the farms that you're buying from, or transitioning to agroforestry from like a full sun system for coffee, for example, can actually help reduce the
Yeah.
shocks from those types of actions. So if we can, but those dots have often not been connected. Some of it is a research challenge. Some of it is like just the wrong people. The frameworks are still being developed for companies to understand their risks. But the point is connecting these like real business risks with these carbon frameworks and layering them to show, hey, and then we could talk about nature and talk about the resilience of communities and how all these things can support companies' real business.
So
So that basically,
I was gonna say, it kind of
yeah, go
sounds
ahead.
like that in setting as we're moving into 2026 and beyond can almost be a reconciliation tool from
That's the goal.
the, if you will, some of the weaknesses in the at least the kind of traditional carbon market as we knew it, which really zeroed in
Yeah.
at the expense of potentially other more holistic ecological repair. Carbon markets just zeroed in on that on carbon as it's sequestered no matter how you got there, and that created all kinds of issues downstream, right, to communities, to the actual ecological health and repair, like what biological ecosystem integrity. And it's creating a space where those groups, like for us in the biodiversity sector, who are trying to find how to best express the value of rigorous methodology development, MRV and other activities to give value to what like a holistic ecological repair looks like. That in setting, it seemed like it
Yeah.
could play a little role of bringing the best of what carbon could be and the best of what biodiversity could be and community resilience
Yeah.
into more
Yeah.
of a single stream or something that's just got a
Yeah.
little bit more of a
Line point.
coherent, multi-dimensional value proposition for corporations, for financial institutions, for standards bodies, and for folks on the ground. Can you speak more about some of the exciting space in that you see coming up?
Yeah, I think the pieces are starting to fall into place. I guess it's curious where you want to go from that. You can go a lot of
Yeah.
places.
Why don't we go there from what does this look like on the ground?
Oh, okay.
You're working close to the ground. It sounds like in more the regenerative
Yeah.
agriculture side of the supply chains. I know that from what I've heard that there's sometimes still disconnect on what's happening on the ground, like in getting that behavioral
Yeah.
change,
Yes.
stewardship changes on the ground to match up and have a through
Yeah.
line all the way into a corporate goal and objective, right? That where you really feel the signal and connection to that being like a positive value add really all the way up and down.
Yeah.
So how's it,
Yeah.
how will it shift how we engage with our land stewards on the ground when it comes to ecological repair, and at the same time actually have a material uplift and recognized value at the corporate board setting? Working on
Yeah.
what do you see as some of the exciting stories or opportunities that kind of illustrate the power of what a proper or emerging insetting program might offer for that entire value
Yeah.
chain?
Yeah, I think one of the key things that is just starting to happen, and I've got some interesting work on this in a large coffee producing region in Colombia, is just as one example. But as you've seen, there's a few companies that are front runners and have invested in these types of programs, who have done just taking this more kind of holistic action, not focusing just on what counts their carbon footprint, but like more holistic kind of restoration. We've been doing some of that work with pulling together funding from a bunch of different type of actors. But the core challenge has been, in part, it's great you have a couple of leading companies that are going to go and invest, for example, in forest. Like, for example, just to make, I know you were trying to get to the grounds. For example, we are doing restoration in a large coffee producing region in Colombia, and also integrated with protection and obviously paying
Sure.
farmers to support those outcomes, in short. To scale that to the entire region, you need 20 companies, not one or two that are leaders. And so all that we're working on there, for example, is trying to figure out how do we create a simple infrastructure that allows those 20 companies to just put all the resources in one together, rather than having their own standalone programs, which is the more standard
Sure.
approach right now because it's so kind of niche. And I think that will be that kind of sector. And then the business case for the companies individually for doing that becomes much clearer, because it's not, oh, I'm not going to invest to support this entire landscape when I only buy
Yeah,
1%
sure.
of the crops coming from. It becomes, oh, as a sector, we buy 80% of the crops coming from this. And so we have a vested interest as a sector in preventing this landscape from not being able to produce the commodity that we buy anymore. And also, obviously, there's all these things that go along with that: environmental destruction or loss of livelihoods. So those kind of collaborative approaches, I think, are going to, in addition to those, so there's like the standards have to show that it counts. We have to connect the business risk with the actual carbon oriented interventions, and then I'll enable this kind of, with those things, it's enabling conditions you need for companies to invest as it's the sector level and collectively doing that. And then you could very clearly see eventually, and it goes beyond, you talked about insetting versus offsetting. I don't see them as either or. They're both really helpful complementary tools, right? Like in a given landscape, just like a crude example, you could imagine it makes a lot of sense for a coffee company to be supporting restoration on and around coffee farms. But like in this region I discussed, most of the land is actually
Yeah.
for beef. And that's going to local markets where there's probably not going to be an insetting buyer. It makes a lot of sense to have maybe the tech companies of the world support restoration on those parts of it. And then there's other parts that maybe adaptation oriented finance might be able to complement. But what we've missed right now is we just get little pieces of each of those. And the hope is that insetting can, if we scale this in a high integrity way, that we can provide a really robust basis from which to build that package that might bring in. Then you have local governments that says, oh, companies are putting money on the table. This is clearly basically the more chips you put into the landscape, the more each of the actors has a clear case for supporting its
Great.
sustenance, I guess, rather than right now.
Are there particular industries? You mentioned coffee. I've heard you mention beef. Are there particular supply chains that are, you think, really ripe for radical expansion of insetting type programs to connect the consumer product good company all the way down to the
Yeah.
ground? Could you name a few of the characteristics of those supply chains that you think make them quite ripe and, if you will, low hanging fruit for radical expansion of insetting as a new vector for ecological repair?
Yeah. The ones that are probably the most, cocoa has gone quite far. As far as it depends on the model you were talking about, but the tree crops like coffee and cocoa are often talked about because they're often in like key biodiversity areas, right? Like they're grown in the same area, so we have forests, and so there's a lot of ecological value. But also they can grow in agroforestry systems, which are like usually the starting point, because then you can actually plant trees directly on the farm. Whereas if you've got a very like a maize crop, you're not going to interplant maize with trees
Sure.
at a large scale. But what you could do is uses boundary fencing. There's different models for different commodities. But another reason is obviously they're high value commodities, and there's been a lot of focus because of historical sustainability concerns on traceability. So companies know where they're buying from, and so they can make that case very clearly for making investments. I think it's a totally different world, but you mentioned regen ag, like on the row crops, huge potential there. One of the key challenges for that is that the current incentives are that companies should invest in places where like kind of it almost, and this is what we're trying to change, it almost can create a little bit of a bias towards
Yeah,
monocrops, because if there's a monocrop produced and I somehow reduce the carbon footprint of it, I get to claim all the
that's right.
production. Whereas when you transition to the more regenerative system that might have 6 rotations or even 3 or 4 rotations plus intercropping plus, then it becomes more supply chains you have to allocate that impact to. And so it actually becomes more complicated and I get to claim less of it. So that's one of the core, in this report I mentioned, is one of the core other dynamics. There's traceability, there's that kind of allocation. And then there's this proximity question of I only get to count stuff that's directly on my farm or on the plot, even though the real opportunity might be beside the plot. I think I definitely
Great.
riffed further from
Now,
your
let's
question.
have one more area, and before we close out, is really one of the areas that we've been, I'd like to think, pioneering and also just deeply in a learning space is the interactions with local communities, right? IPLCs, indigenous
Yeah.
communities, local folks on the ground who already have relationships to the
Yeah.
land, right? They've been stewarding that land for some period of time. It could be thousands of years or it could be hundreds of years, but regardless, they're a deep part of the landscape. And to come in with programs that are attuned to the cultural and civic needs of those communities, I'm curious where you see opportunities in the insetting programs that are emergent to consider deeply the humans are a deep part of those landscapes and how you design and measure, report, and
Yeah.
verify that the impacts of those communities is in fact a positive impact, and what how we can are developing fail safes or methodological interventions to make sure that those communities are being deeply considered in the design and execution of these insetting programs.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was one, and that project that I mentioned that's ongoing in Colombia. That was one of the key portions, was we wanted to make sure we design a system that not only meets the needs of corporates and the claims and allocations and stuff, but actually meets the needs of the farmers, right? If this is not solving problems for them, and that could come in multiple forms, it could come in technical assistance, it could come in payments and for ecosystem services. But I think, yeah, bringing them into design right now, it's often been scoped. That is that can be the risk of starting with just how do we meet our carbon claims from a company, and then let's put out without kind of considering those like the kind of like systematic level risks I was discussing or mentioning before. That's one part of it, right? Is like ensuring that, and there's one argument here that the existence of the carbon market is actually can be helpful with this because it puts some price
Sure.
pressure potentially on the incentive, right? Like the carbon is at the end of the day a commodity, and so if we want to ensure that there's fair livelihoods being given to the producers that are developing this service, it's not a terrible thing, and that's a controversial thing within a
Sure.
lot of commodity supply chains. But the other element I just want to mention is like most of these practices that we're talking about, whether it's regen ag practices or restoration practices or land management practices, like the vast majority have been done by some indigenous
Sure.
peoples or
That's
local
right.
communities for generations, right? So that's the other part of this, is like making sure that the solutions we're pulling on are actually responsive to the local context and using the local knowledge that's already, yeah, been
Great.
established.
Hey, tie us out on a hopeful note. You get up every morning, you got to go to work. You're working in a field that, and some might say we have some headwinds currently, and certainly we've got up against the big challenges. What's bringing you hope? What are you really excited about that, yeah, keeps you moving? And yeah, just take us away on something that's uplifting for Elijah to get out of bed and give it your all every day.
Yeah. I think I should have actually gotten the statistic for this, but I saw a recent survey that was really uplifting for me. It was basically just talking about how 90 something percent of CEOs are still moving forward and expanding their sustainability stuff, their sustainability efforts. Basically, that this, despite the changes in narratives and talking about it, the sector is
Yeah.
moving forward. Like investments are still happening. That's one, like the demand signal is going to be there. And the other one is I've recently been in some kind of like standard setting, coming up against some of these technical barriers and standard setting circles. And I was very heartened to just starting off conversations with folks who are very opposed to some of the holistic, I'd framed it as they're opposed to these kind of holistic expansion. But realizing that once we got into the conversation, once we actually discussed what we were trying to accomplish and what they were trying to accomplish, like that we're all really on the same page. And I feel like I've been very heartened by how it seems like conceptually and everyone is trying to do the right thing, and we're all headed actually in the same direction. It just becomes devils in
Yeah,
the details as to what that
totally
looks
right.
like. So it's always helpful to be talking to other folks in the space, from totally different
Yeah,
political.
wonderful. Elijah and Conservation International, appreciate your investment in this space and leadership. Very excited to see what's on board for all of us. Keen to see rapid expansion of Insetting, and grateful for your time. I appreciate you joining us here today on the show.